Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album from Xiu Xiu, Girl with Basket of Fruit. Well, about time I finally got to this. And here's where we need a bit of backstory, because at the start of February on Twitter, I participated in a little thing called, appropriately, Music Writing Exercise, or hashtag MWE. And for me, it was a cute little side project to knock out some quips surrounding back catalogs I was covering alongside my regular views, because again, I'm still really busy. And I figured that given Xiu Xiu had been one of my most glaring holes in my musical knowledge, just hadn't had time to get to them, I'd listen to the entire discography for hashtag MWE, and thus I could properly review their newest critically divisive project. And well, it's complicated, but also not quite as complicated as I was expecting, because Xiu Xiu's put out a lot of wiry, abrasive provocation for their time. And now there's some absolutely great albums. You can definitely hear their influence across plenty of experimental acts, especially with the ones more on a focus on queer sexuality and especially Perfume Genius. But in hearing the discography as a whole, it's just easy to get kind of burned out on some of the shock tactics and transgressions, or notice when the group isn't quite playing to their strengths. For one, I've always been convinced that they've got a knack for striking, maybe even mainstream accessible pop melodies and some high concept ideas they rarely get the credit or analysis they deserve, most because it's way easier to focus on the profanity and the explicit content and all the sheer noise. But at the same time, there are some stretches in that discography that seem to be coasting on airs, especially when they bring in a delicacy that feels rather baroque but a little bit undercomposed. And that doesn't count with the great ideas when they don't quite stick the landing, and that happens more often than they probably want to admit. And while singer-songwriter Jamie Stewart is a potent mastermind behind this, if you've got a keen ear, you can very much tell how and where and from whom his sound is inspired and shaped, which could put a bit of a damper both on the whole transgressive art and the whole unique, boundary-pushing experimentation. And that's not getting to the points where Xiu Xiu will just recycle some old material and ideas a little bit too readily. And if you got an ear for it, you'll know. But still, they did ditch John Congleton's production this time around for the new album, and with the subject matter headlines surrounding female martyrdom, alright, why not dive headfirst into some transgressive art? It's been too long, so what do we get with Girl with Basket of Fruit? Well, we sure as hell got something. And for me, you're not getting a typical review, that's for damn sure. Because once again, we are getting a difficult album from Xiu Xiu. If you're expecting hooks or stable tunes or anything more than just a purely textural experience, you're probably going to wind up disappointed. And I say textural because even before you dig up the interviews, it becomes abundantly clear that Xiu Xiu's trying to actively resist straightforward analysis with Girl with Basket of Fruit. It's a project that is so thoroughly consumed by its own nihilism that it's hard to avoid the possibility that Jamie Stewart's just mercilessly trolling, spewing forth flamboyant poetry and daring the audience to find some meaning in it when there really just isn't any. But that's not quite it, is it? Rather that if there is meaning or a place where the emotive resonance truly cuts him more effectively, he couldn't possibly comment, which can give the impression of an overloaded string of inside jokes and grotesque imagery held together with the most tenuous flashes of context that you can only barely understand, which is what a lot of critics have suggested, but I'd also argue there's maybe even more going on here. And I just wish I liked it more, because I'm not remotely convinced this is all that good, especially when you're not mesmerized by what's on display. I mean, it's not bad, but I wouldn't exactly call this great either. But okay, let's start off with setting the context with the two broader statements that Stewart provided. Firstly, that there is a feral draw towards the intersection of aesthetic culture and art and underground spirituality, or to translate it, the sort of vaguely articulated baser traditions outside of the Western values, and their emotive expression and amplification through art and culture that would be inspired by it. In other words, he's cherry-picking what is to mainstream sensibilities defies the most reason and good taste, and then filtering it through Xiu Xiu's more distinctive emotive spectrum, of which we're all familiar. Which leads to the second statement. A belief that as a species we are fucked, because we are destroying the planet, and through this emotional figure, what would comprise our grave marker? What has humanity truly delivered? And again, this is a project that is consumed by nihilistic depression, and let's be honest, that's an undercurrent that's run through a lot of Xiu Xiu's material, and should be unsurprising for a frontman who cites Morrissey as his favorite artist. But when you couple it with material that's more amorphous texture than structured songs, this album is more about capturing a fractured emotional vantage point rather than actually having a theme or making a point. Hell, its resistance of analysis could well be making a point in and of itself that we can't possibly know a true concrete answer. But that's not saying that there aren't elements that can't be observed. I mean, for one, it's very telling that for as graphic as the first song can be, the whole animals and assholes and painful masturbation into mush that splits the difference between the retching and completely childish, which prompts a scream to nobody to stop laughing, it's still mostly set up as something of a joke. Mostly through direct references on the second psalm, it comes out as a joke. A pretty sick joke to be sure, and one that hits a skewed, uncomfortable balance between empathetic and voyeuristic. But hey, if your punchline is drenched in nihilism with the subtext that nothing matters, we're all dead anyway, kind of kills a bit of the stakes and kind of weakens some of the emotional investment. Well, alright, there's always been some element of listening to Jamie Stewart jerk off on every Xiu Xiu album, but I did mention voyeurism before, and there's something almost discomforting about how this project seems to revel in this territory. Going into the opening title track, Stewart has described the central metaphor as an inversion of a Caravaggio painting, and how the martyr is portrayed in art through flipping the gender from male to female, from beatic exaltation of men to the fetishistic focus on torture of women, especially their sexual characteristics. And he's not wrong about that either. There's a reason why rape revenge stories and movies have a market. Men are exalted for their suffering, but with women, the focus is solely on said suffering for the audience. Hell, it's one reason why I was so goddamn annoyed with Darren Aronofsky's Mother a few years back. But Stewart seems to conveniently ignore how that has been a significant factor to give his own provocative subject matter some weight and shock value. And when he tries to sidestep things by saying it's wrung from gallows humor, it's very telling how he's not really at the gallows. Go to A Margie v. Moo, a song reportedly inspired by a friend dying of cancer and him helpless on the sidelines, and the unknown question of what might come next. But then Stewart interrupts the track to go at everyone, which is exactly something you can do when you feel the stakes don't impact you in the same way. Skip ahead further on the album to Mary Turner, a story of a real-life lynching and mutilation of a pregnant black woman and her unborn child. And while you could tell that Stewart has some visceral rage directed at the poison system that allowed white men and women in the South to get away with this, but was this his story to tell? Was the camera of his words best suited to linger on every gory detail amidst the context of apocalyptic feral nihilism? And once that question snaps into view, the other voyeuristic moments also raise some questions. The implied rape and the pitiful stammering denials on Ice Cream Truck, the suicidal murk of scissors amidst a cloud of old blues, the framing which I would definitely question, but that's a different conversation. And then there's Pumpkin Attack on Mommy and Daddy, which questions humanity's naturally animalistic state, whether or not it was really a good idea to gain sentience at all, and then realize the atrocities we've committed and left behind. But you know what, let's circle back to the first two statements I made. The artistic amplification of humanity's baser impulses potentially driven off of spirituality, and an overwhelming cushion of nihilistic attachment, all amidst a lot of horrifying stories, but nearly all of them at the expense of somebody else in the text. Oh, Jamie Stewart is selling them as hard as he can, as if they have some visceral personal meaning to him, but that nihilism does allow a manufactured distance, a diminishment of the stakes for him that allows it to spray it all on stage, regardless of any question or responsibility in its telling. And here's the thing, he even acknowledges this, first being the earthy, quasi-pagan, abstract love song The Wrong Thing, reportedly inspired by a lot of bondage imagery because it's a Jamie Stewart, and of course it is, but then more prominently on the closing song Normal Love, where at the basest of levels, he realizes for that connection he doesn't need to feel pride or respect, he just wants to feel something. To quote him directly, just let me pretend I have something to lose. Something. Self-aware and poignant, maybe, but it only reinforces the navel-gazing of this project, that for as much as he's showcasing horrible things to show humanity's hidden truth, the emotional arc and the attempt at resonance is focused on his story. And there is a sick sense of irony that for as much as he wants to make a statement about how the systems in Western culture brutalizes others, especially who are more marginalized, he ignores how much of his art appropriates the story and struggle on the same principle, and retreats to the cheap defense of abstract nihilism to deflect and excuse it. And yet I'm not remotely surprised he wound up here. It's exactly the sort of project that gets made when you sucked your own personal vices and drama dry, especially when so much of Xiu Xiu's career has relied upon finding ways to shock the audience. And this will probably get there, although for the intentions and the reasons we should question. But let's ask what might be the more important question. Who cares? Because you can definitely make the argument that most people will not be diving nearly as deeply as I am into the thematic contradictions and iconography of Xiu Xiu in comparison with just marveling at the stunned horror and the vistas on display. So should we just highlight or talk about that? Well, that's one reason why I brought up some of the weakened stakes being contributed by that nihilism. But in all due honesty, just some of the language choices that Stewart uses can be just as compromising. I get the dramatic juxtaposition between high poetry and more visceral, guttural language. Nick Cave's been doing this for decades, but it starts to wear a little thin when he's talking about pee-pees and bananas. Again, it fractures the atmosphere that Xiu Xiu's trying to create in a way that would seem mimetic if Stewart hasn't made it abundantly clear in interviews that he's generally bored by the internet. Interesting. But it's also another example of an element that diminishes the tension of the album, which is kind of a shame because when you start considering the actual sound and pieces we get here, Xiu Xiu is still a pretty potent act, featuring Stewart's contorted vocals against some of the most cavernous and alien instrumentation to date. Well, I say that with the acknowledgement, again, that we're not dealing with much in terms of the way of hooks or song structure or even coherent melody most of the time, and that some of the more abrasive elements do have parallels to material that Xiu Xiu pursued before, especially on knife play, including stuff I've liked, for the record, because I do like knife play. And I will say that there are some sonic ideas I appreciate here. I like how Stewart pushes his delivery with this much rawness. I dig the coursing, fragmented tension off the hammering percussion grooves, supplemented by the spongy, cavernous nicks and the alien shrieks. And most of all, I do like that sense of fractured beauty that comes through with the organic strings quaking beneath the margins. Moments of real beauty that's strewn amidst the carnage. And again, I'll absolutely acknowledge that Normal Love is a striking closer. The muted pianos, the great subtle acoustic touches. It is the feel of some of the best of Xiu Xiu's ballads, but it also has got a tune, which is something that the majority of this project doesn't even care to have. I'd argue more this takes influence from no wave and industrial music, but at least in the latter case, you'd hope for a groove or a more solid climax, whereas we might get some of the former and all the quaking, howling noise, but the latter, it rarely arrives. More reliant on blowing out the percussion and the vocals for a broad, unstable shock value rather than any sort of real pacing. And again, there are some individual moments that work. The agonized industrial touches of the title track, the rusted out elegance of The Wrong Thing, the oily bells and the shuddering bass beats behind Mary Turner, or the fragmented techno rattle of Pumpkin Attack on Mommy and Daddy that also reminded me a bit of Death Grips. But you know what, between the gratuitous pitch shifting, the points where any hope of melody just descends into incoherent babble, and the near continuous lack of payoff, many of these pieces start off with a lot of potential, really a lot of alien abrasion that gets in your face, but wind up as just kind of feeling less than some of their parts. I'm not that mesmerized or that shocked. And look, I already know what some of you are trying to say. You're clearly not appreciative of the monstrous beauty on display, and you've gone on record as not really being a fan of nihilistic art. Of course this wasn't about to work for you. And yeah, the latter statement's true. Until you compare this to what Daughters delivered with What You Won't Get What You Want, which takes some similar iconography and tones along with some very deeply nihilistic themes, and then realize through accessibility and structure they could terrify so many more people instead of indulging in self-serving deflection and recycling. Lessons that both Swans and Nick Cave have learned and realized in different ways as well. Hell, you'd think that Xiu Xiu themselves would have learned this, given how often their tuneful accessibility has often been their greatest strength in order to shock the audience. That was the case in their last full-length project, Forget. But for an album that seems to want to hold a mirror up to the world's decay and rot and eventual end, they just grew more interested in their own reflection. And that happens. A shame the insight in mind from that feels more sparse than ever, which means I'm giving this a strong 6 out of 10 and a recommendation if you're a Xiu Xiu fan or just looking for a challenging listen, but the group's done better. And in the face of this reflection, it's alien, I'll say it, but I'm not mesmerized. Sorry. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, this is a long review, but I had a lot to say, and I wanted to make sure I articulated this one properly, because this gets complicated when you're dealing with the sort of levels of deflection and nihilism. But hey, if you want to buy or stream it, links down there below, and I got the poll up there. I'm curious where you guys all fall on this, because I know it's getting a lot of critical acclaim that will not be shared by me. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you guys want to get involved in supporting the channel, link to my Patreons right over there. Still trying to reconfigure things, but we'll see how it goes. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.